I turned 27 today, and within 5 minutes of sitting down at a white linen table in one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants, my entire life split neatly into a before and an after. The first sign was the way the staff changed posture. Back straighter, steps quieter, like someone important had just walked in. Then I saw him, my grandfather Walter. The man who skipped most holidays without apology, who built an empire out of concrete and skyline, who could chill a room by simply lifting an eyebrow. He crossed the floor with a softness that didn't match his reputation, kissed my cheek and said, "Happy birthday, Caitlyn." He sat beside me, ignoring my parents' jittery smiles. His assistant, Jennifer, a razor-sharp 40-something with a tablet glued to her palm, hovered nearby. "I wanted to check on you," he said in that measured baritone that made other people listen harder. "Jennifer's update on your portfolio looked solid. The trust has been riding the market well." I must have blinked wrong. "Why, you what?" He studied my face the way a developer evaluates a floor plan. "The trust we created when you were born. You crossed 25 2 years ago. Control should already be in your hands." He offered the sentence as if it were the weather. Ordinary. Expected. Silver flashed at the corners of my parents' smiles as they went rigid. My mother's fingers strangled her water glass. My father adjusted his cufflinks like they were suddenly too tight. "I don't have a trust," I said carefully. "No one's ever told me about any of this." Something behind my grandfather's eyes hardened, the way a lake freezes overnight. "Of course you do," he replied. $5 million to start. Your cousins have theirs. Yours was the largest. Managed by your parents until your 25th, then transferred to you." The dining room noise fell away like someone had pressed mute. I worked as a junior graphic designer at a boutique agency, sharing a slightly shabby 2-bedroom with my college friend Olivia. I counted grocery receipts. I brought my own coffee to meetings so I didn't have to buy one. A trust? A transfer? None of it fit the life I knew. Walter tilted his head. "And you're comfortable in the Gold Coast apartment?" "I picked that building for a reason. Security, lake views." "What apartment?" The words came out so thin I barely heard them myself. All the color drained from my father's face. My mother's smile collapsed. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Jennifer," he said, eyes still on my parents, "note that Caitlyn is unaware of both the trust and the property." My father cleared his throat. "Walter, we can explain." "I'm sure you will," Walter said almost pleasantly. Then to me with a warmth that softened the steel, "You will have answers tonight. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, tap like and subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what went down in that private room is the most surreal family conversation I've ever had. I should tell you what my life looked like 10 minutes before everything detonated. I'm Caitlyn. 27 as of today. I grind at design. Logos, pitch decks, brand refreshes for clients who want champagne on a tap water budget. I carry nearly $70,000 in student loans that I've been chipping at since graduation. My roommate Olivia and I live in a building with charm if you squint. Mismatched chairs, thrifted frames, art prints we've traded like baseball cards. My parents, Harold and Diane, have the comfortable suburban glow. 5 bedrooms, a pool, perfect hedges. They preach character, hard work, and we don't subsidize adulthood. They congratulated me at graduation with a firm handshake and a personal finance book about bootstrapping your way out of debt. I told myself I respected that. Mostly I did. Except on the nights the math didn't work, when my mom casually mentioned a kitchen remodel and my dad rolled up in a car with leather that still smelled like the dealership. There were warning shivers I didn't recognize as earthquakes. Dad shutting down my idea of a master's program before I finished the sentence. Mom changing the subject when I said rent had gone up again. Quiet phone calls that went very quiet when I walked into a room. An open browser tab with real estate listings in Panama. "Just daydreaming," my mother said too quickly, snapping the laptop shut. "We might travel more," Dad added at breakfast a week later, eyes fixed on his cereal. This morning, Olivia gave me a little plant I'd been eyeing and a handmade card that made me cry. Tonight, my parents insisted on this restaurant. One of those places that trusts you to be too embarrassed to ask the prices. The champagne waited in a silver cradle. My mom wore a dress I'd never seen with a necklace that could cover a year of my rent. My dad's cufflinks winked under chandeliers that made everyone look more polished than they were. We did small talk calisthenics, A movie they liked, relatives I barely remember, my job search since the agency lost a client and cut 5 of us last week, including me. When I tried to say I was scared about rent, the conversation slid off the subject like oil on glass. They handed me a designer wallet and a scarf from a brand I only window shop on my phone. Build credit. Mom lectured like we were in the kitchen and not under a crystal halo. Then the room changed. And Walter arrived. And the floor opened. Let's move somewhere private, Walter told the manager after that first impossible exchange, his politeness hiding something far colder. Jennifer will need a quiet room. We were escorted into a paneled chamber meant for 12. It felt like a courtroom with a better wine list. Walter took the head of the table, I sat to his right. My parents faced us like they'd wandered into the wrong scene. Jennifer stationed herself by the door, already tapping. Within minutes, Stanley, my grandfather's longtime attorney, slipped in, efficient and understated, carrying a leather case that looked older than me. I brought the original trust instruments, he said, setting down a neat stack of files, and the most recent statements. Walter nodded once. For Caitlyn, he said. From the top. Stanley turned to me. When you were born, your grandfather established a trust in your name. Initial funding, $5 million. Your parents, as trustees, had authority to use funds for your education, health, and general welfare up to your 25th birthday with documentation. On your 25th, all control transfers to you. He paused, gentler. You should have been informed at 18. I stared at the folders as if they might bite. No one told me. Ever. Walter's jaw worked once. Nor, he said, did the transfer occur at 25. Stanley slid a summary sheet across the table. As of the last quarter, 3 months ago, the trust was valued at approximately $8.3 million. That figure reflects growth, minus tuition disbursements and the purchase of a 2-bedroom unit in Lakeside Tower 2 years back. The room bloomed around the edges like I wasn't getting enough air. 8.3. While I was checking couch cushions for quarters, while I was packing leftovers for 3 meals, there were 8.3 million reasons my life should have been different. Walter's voice was so even it made my skin prickle. Given that Caitlyn has never lived in Lakeside Tower, he said to my parents without looking at them, I'll ask only once, how were funds used? My father tried for steady and missed. There were investments. Some things didn't perform. It's temporary. Allocations. Stop, Walter said, not loud, just final. He looked at Jennifer. Call Stanley back if he steps out. Connect with security at my office. We'll need full records. Already done, she said without looking up. I found my voice and with it, a heat I didn't know I could pull from my chest. I worked double shifts. I skipped meals to pay Sally Mae. I shared a bathroom with a stranger at 26. And you, I couldn't finish the sentence. Stanley's pen ticked down his page. He moved another sheet into the light. I need to be precise, he said, eyes scanning, mouth tightening. Beginning roughly 7 years ago, there are recurring transfers to accounts in the names of Harold and Diane. Disbursements not categorized as education or health. Large purchases. Personal expenses. Based on this preliminary review, approximately $300,000 remains under trust control. He looked up. Everything else has been diverted. Silence can roar. This one did. My mother's eyes filled in a way that used to melt me when I was 10. It didn't now. We were going to put it back, she said, voice threadbare. It got away from us. A mortgage, my father said quickly. 2 vehicles. Some business investments. The house in Florida, my mother added so quietly I almost missed it. And travel. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't need volume to convey fury. Jennifer, he said, reach Detective Ramirez at Financial Crimes. My father leaned forward, palms out. Walter, please. This is family. This is theft, Walter answered, his look making the wood paneling feel colder. The scale removes any ambiguity. I was shaking. Jennifer set a glass of water in front of me, the small kindness landing like a life preserver. I hadn't drunk anything. My mouth was dust. My head was a hive of snapshots reframed. My mother's new necklace the same week my rent went up. My father's trip to Arizona for a conference when I stopped eating lunch to pay for a winter coat. My parents waving from a yacht deck in a photo my aunt texted while I was commuting on a bus with a broken heater. Walter turned back to me and his voice softened enough to cut. Caitlyn, you decide how far this goes. We will recover what we can. Crimes can be prosecuted. Or not. Your call. I can't, not now, I managed. The room, the numbers, the laughter from the dining room leaking under the door. It was all wrong, like a set that didn't match the script. I need time. That's reasonable, Walter said. Then to Stanley, crisp again, freeze everything they control. Every account. Every title connected to trust dollars. I want a forensic trail from the first unauthorized withdrawal to the last. And the apartment. Locks changed tonight, Stanley said. Keys delivered to Caitlyn. My father tried one last time, his voice shredding at the edges. Be reasonable. Where are we supposed to go? Walter looked at him, and for a second I saw the man who negotiated with heads of banks like they were buying used cars. You're still living for the moment in a 5-bedroom house paid with money stolen from your daughter. Enjoy the last nights you'll have there. The manager knocked softly to ask if we needed anything else. The check, Walter said without looking up. We're finished here. We weren't finished. Not even close. But the room had told the truth, and the truth wasn't leaving with us. The cab ride home was a vacuum. The city slid past like a movie I'd seen before and couldn't follow anymore. Walter offered one of his places. I said no. I needed my thrift store couch and the plant Olivia had placed on our little table this morning. I needed to be touched by something that hadn't lied to me. Olivia opened the door and took one look at my face. She wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, guided me to the couch and waited. I said the sentence out loud and it sounded ridiculous floating in our tiny living room. My parents stole $8 million from me. I told her everything, stops and starts, out-of-order fragments, the sound of my mother's fork on china right before Walter sat down, the phrase, "What apartment?" that split a dinner into a crime scene. That anger that arrived like a second heartbeat didn't leave. It wouldn't for a long time. I applied for food assistance last year, I said, and the shame of that, useless and leftover, flashed hot. I ate ramen for 4 nights in a row so I could pay the electric. And I couldn't finish the picture. I didn't have to. We both saw it. My phone vibrated like it was trying to claw its way off the table. Dad. Mom again. I stared at their names until they blurred. Walter's message was the only one I answered. You're safe? Do you need anything tonight? I wrote back, I'm home. I'll call tomorrow. He responded, good. The morning after turned out to be a conveyor belt. Jennifer called at 8 with bullet points and calm urgency. The Florida house, the primary residence, both vehicles, directly traceable to trust funds, she said. We've engaged a forensic team. The preliminary figure remains that roughly $300,000 is intact. The rest is real estate, luxury purchases, and ill-advised investments. I'd planned to update my portfolio and fire off resumes. I didn't. Walter's driver took me from one glass and steel office to another. Attorneys, an advisor who spoke fluent spreadsheet, and a therapist who specialized in betrayal by people who share your last name. I met Walter for tea in the afternoon in an office that overlooked the river. He poured his own. He always did when something mattered. You didn't miss anything, he told me after I stumbled through a useless apology for not seeing earlier what had been done to me. You weren't told. You had no frame for suspicion. That's how this works. Trust is a blind spot by design. 3 days later, Jennifer called with an update that made my mouth go dry all over again. Your parents bought plane tickets to Panama, she said. Booked 3 days before the dinner. Of course they did. Of course they wanted out. Of course the fancy birthday wasn't a kindness. It was cover. Keeping up appearances for one last night in case Walter showed. He had. Their exit evaporated. Extended family did what extended family does. Clustered into opinion camps. My father's siblings called it a misunderstanding that would be best handled without lawyers. My mother's sister phoned me, voice shaking, to say she was ashamed by what her sister had done. The weirdest knock on my door was from my cousin Natalie, the one whose feeds were always a rotating portfolio of beaches, brunches, and boxes with ribbon you don't throw away. I always wondered why Uncle Harold and Aunt Diane's life looked bigger, she said, perched on my threadbare couch, the contrast not lost on either of us. Dad said our trusts were comparable. Mine's not tiny, but it's not that. She hesitated. I thought you had the loving parent thing and you were just humble about the money. I didn't know they were taking yours. It was the first friendship in this mess I didn't expect. The story leaked. Not my name but Walter's. A paragraph in a business column about a family dispute and possible misappropriation. I deleted social media for a while. I couldn't bear the idea of high school acquaintances connecting dots and DMing me faux sympathy or gossip. Guilt is strange. It showed up uninvited, sat on my chest, and asked if I'd caused any of this by not paying better attention, by not asking smarter questions, by not somehow stopping a theft I didn't know to suspect. In therapy, I learned there's a name for that reflex. It helps to know the name. It doesn't make the feeling vanish. Direct hit mid-video nudge. If this story is hitting a nerve, if a money secret ever detonated in your life, drop a comment. You can keep it vague. Like if you want more true family stories told without fluff, and subscribe so you catch the next chapters. We're about to walk into a mediation where every dollar gets traced. A month after the night that split my life, Walter asked me to meet him at his penthouse. He sent the staff home and made the drinks himself. There were photos on the table I hadn't seen. My grandmother laughing in a sun hat. My mother as a kid on Walter's shoulders. Walter as a young man in a hard hat, grinning in front of the skeleton of a now famous building. Family is complicated, he said, a sentence that sounded simple until you tried to live inside it. We don't get to edit the past. We do get to choose what happens next. Next looked like a conference room 40 floors up, my grandfather on one side, my parents on the other. A timeline of withdrawals on a screen that did not care about anyone's feelings. The forensic team had receipts. They drew a clean line from first small borrow to last large transfer. A staircase built out of rationalizations. Mortgage. Cars. A second house. A failed luxury real estate venture. Day trading that burned money faster than a match. When the presentation ended, Walter didn't thunder. He laid out options like a contract. Cooperate fully. Sign over assets purchased with trust funds. Enter a structured repayment plan for whatever can't be liquidated. And we keep this civil. Fight us and we go criminal. Fraud. Embezzlement. My parents' lawyer said the words cooperate fully, so fast he almost tripped over them. Walter didn't look at him. He looked at me. Your call. I didn't want them in prison. I wanted my life back. I wanted honesty even if it was ugly. I wanted acknowledgement spoken out loud in a room where the walls could hear. Civil, I said. But everything recoverable comes back. And they say exactly what they did. To me. To you. Paperwork swallowed the rest of the day. Titles shifted. Signatures collected. The Florida house became a number on a spreadsheet waiting to be converted back into money with my name on it. The cars turned into assessed values. The jewelry went into velvet boxes labeled to appraise. When the attorneys left to make copies, the room got very quiet. It was just the three of us. Me and the two people who taught me to tie my shoes and were teaching me now, late and painfully, about the limits of love without integrity. Why? I asked, and there wasn't any anger in it anymore, just a question hollowed out by everything it had already cost. I need to understand the story you told yourselves. My mother didn't reach for my hand. She'd learned. It started small, she said. A gap to cover. We were already living a little past our means. Your father made some bad bets early and we were always catching up. When we had access, it felt like a cushion we deserved. For raising you. For the sacrifices. We kept saying we'd put it back. We never did. My father's eyes were glassy in a way I'd rarely seen. We have a problem with status, he said. With spending. With how we look to other people. We're getting help. It doesn't balance the ledger. It's just the truth. Truth is a beginning. It isn't an ending. 2 weeks later, I put keys on a new hook in a small one-bedroom that was actually mine. Not the glittering condo that should have been handed to me at 25, but a safe, well-located place Walter had insisted I choose for my life as it is, not as it should have been. The first night I slept like I hadn't in months. With Walter's guidance, the recovery team assembled numbers that made a different kind of sense. After liquidating what could be liquidated, the Florida property, the cars, the boat, the tangible luxuries, the investments worth unwinding, we were looking at just over $1 million. A fraction of what should have been there. Still, for someone who had memorized the price of every item in her pantry, it was a cliff into safety. A design job opened through one of Walter's contacts. He refused to make the offer for me. He made the introduction and left the rest to my portfolio and my nerve. I got it. Walter and I started a weekly dinner routine. The ritual did something to my bones. Jennifer, who'd been a silhouette in doorways during most of the worst moments, became unexpectedly human, a mentor with excellent advice about office politics and the kind of blunt kindness that never felt like judgment. Somewhere in there, a familiar face from college, Thomas, appeared at the coffee shop near my new place and asked how I'd been. He didn't want gossip. He wanted to know if I liked the beans they used. The relief of that normal question made me laugh in a way I hadn't in weeks. It was the first time since the restaurant that anything felt ordinary, like life could be more than ledgers and loss. We met again a few days later, on purpose this time, and talked until they stacked chairs on tables around us. He asked about the briefs I was working on, the typefaces I hated, the artists who made me want to try harder. When I asked him about his job, he shrugged in that humble way he has and said he liked solving complicated problems other people ran away from. I filed that away because my life was, at that moment, a nest of complicated problems. In between dinners with Walter and long days at the new firm, Stanley's team kept unspooling the thread. The numbers were merciless and precise. Wire transfers with vague descriptions. Consulting fees that weren't fees at all. Shell entities with clean names designed to make you stop asking questions. Every time a line item matched a memory, something in me cracked and then set stronger. The summer dad surprised mom with a remodel? The bonus trip to the Amalfi Coast they took after a tough quarter? The patio that appeared with new stone and an outdoor kitchen that looked like a magazine spread? My trust had been the invisible credit card for all of it. Walter insisted I see the Gold Coast apartment once the locks were changed. Closure is not a spreadsheet, he said, and I hated how right he was. We walked through the staged rooms with their neutral furniture and art that matched nothing because it wasn't supposed to. The view deserved the word breathtaking. I stood at the window a long time, watching boats cut the lake into glittering pieces, thinking about the other life I could have been living. No roommate, no panic over rent, no ramen dinners counted out like penance. "We'll sell it," Walter said, reading my face. "Recovered value, clean title. You don't have to inherit the scene of the crime." I nodded. I didn't want it. I wanted something that didn't smell faintly of betrayal even after a deep clean. Back at the firm, work became ballast. My creative director was the kind of person who noticed who stayed late because they wanted the work to sing, not because they were afraid to go home. He started sliding bigger responsibilities my way. Client calls that actually mattered, mood boards that turned into brand systems, decks where my slides didn't get cut. There was a pitch for a national client that became our office's obsession for 3 weeks. I ran point on the visual language and, for the first time in my career, felt the strange electricity of people trusting my taste. On the morning of the pitch, Walter texted a 3-word blessing he probably thought was casual. "Do it clean." We won. That night I bought fresh flowers and didn't apologize to my bank account for the indulgence. I put them by the kitchen window in the apartment that was truly mine and tried to memorize the small shape of happiness that made my shoulders drop. The civil agreement with my parents meant there were schedules now. Payments, audits, calls no one enjoyed. Their assets moved from being trophies to line items. The Florida house became a listing. The cars turned into auction lots. The jewelry went into velvet trays behind glass under hard light. Each conversion stung and soothed in equal measure. There was nothing satisfying about seeing your childhood living room show up in an inventory, but there was a sharp relief in watching lies become math. I kept my distance mostly. We had a monthly lunch in a quiet place with bad lighting where no one we knew would walk in. My parents arrived early and left late, like they were stretching the minutes in our company because the rest of their time had collapsed. At first they brought explanations. Later they brought apologies. Eventually they brought nothing but questions about my life they had stopped asking years ago. I answered carefully and left before the conversation tipped toward the past. Therapy helped me make rules I could live by. Closeness is not required. My therapist said the day I told her I hated that part of me still worried whether they were eating, and hated that I hated it. Compassion is a boundary too when you choose it instead of bleeding it. I wrote that line down and kept it in my phone. Healing wasn't cinematic. It was a dozen quiet choices a day. Answer Walter's text even when I felt numb. Go to the gym even when I wanted to disappear into a screen. Cook real food instead of punishment noodles. Say yes to a walk with Thomas when my first instinct was to say no to everything. He had a way of finding the tiny seam in a hard day and prying it open just enough for air. Once, when a rumor floated through a trade blog about Walter's family dispute, I spiraled in the privacy of my living room, humiliated by the idea that someone in the comment section might connect me to a headline. Thomas sat on the floor with me, backs against the couch, and told me about a failure from his 20s I would never have guessed at. Everyone is carrying something they don't post, he said, and it felt like a counterspell. Natalie surprised me by becoming real. Without the filter of curated envy between us, we were just two women trying to figure out where the story bent and where it could be straightened. She confessed to years of pretending her life was bigger online because the quiet parts scared her. I confessed to hiding the best parts of myself because I thought I was only allowed to be admirable if I suffered. We made a deal. Tell each other one truth a week that would never have made it onto our feeds. Then she did something I didn't expect. She proposed investing in the mentorship program I'd sketched on napkins and spreadsheets after too much coffee. Not a gift, she said. Equity. I want to build this with you. Walter helped us draft paperwork that protected our friendship from our business and vice versa. Jennifer sat with me one afternoon and made me drive the spreadsheet myself. If you can draw a brand architecture, she said, you can do a cash flow. The first time I sent acceptance emails to 3 young designers, covering their software, assigning mentors, introducing them to a small network of clients who would actually pay them, I cried at my desk in a way that didn't hurt. Their thank you messages were the kind you save. In the middle of all that building, there were still ambushes. I gave a recorded statement to our civil mediator that felt like swallowing glass, answering questions about how many times my mother had said, "We'll help later," or when exactly my father started calling me independent, with that little edge in his voice. It required a new kind of endurance. When we broke for coffee, Jennifer leaned close enough for only me to hear. Your clarity is a gift to your future self, she said. It makes people like me useful. And then there was the day Walter's assistant called with a voice that was too even. He's at the hospital, she said. It's not critical. But it's not nothing. I sat in a chair at his bedside while the machines made soft, terrible noises and watched the person who had been the spine of our family for decades look very human. He woke and scowled at the floor like it had personally offended him. You're supposed to be resting, I said, trying to make light. I am resting, he replied. I'm resting from carrying you all on my back. It was the closest thing to a joke I'd ever heard him attempt. Later, when the room had stilled, he told me stories about my grandmother I hadn't earned before. Her laugh, the way she softened him without making him smaller, the fight they'd had about whether money should be named for what it was instead of polished into opportunities. She would have liked you, he said, and I had to turn away for a minute because grief is heavy even when it's not yours. When he went home, he did it at a slower pace. He allowed a driver instead of insisting on white-knuckle control. He let Jennifer filter calls. He walked in the mornings instead of making the treadmill prove something. He became more deliberate with me too. Your work, he said one dinner, is worth paying for at your rate, not theirs. The next morning I raised my freelance pricing and no one blinked. Somewhere in there we reached the 6-month mark from the night in the restaurant. Walter gathered a handful of people, Jennifer, Stanley, Natalie, and Thomas, in a room that looked like the memory of our last private dinner but warmer. He gave a toast that didn't sound like him and exactly like him. Clipped sentences, soft eyes. Afterward he handed me a small box. Inside was a key and a deed, not the Gold Coast place which had sold and converted to numbers, but a modest, secure apartment close to my office, with light in the morning and a door that felt like an exhale when it closed. This is yours, he said, built with recovered funds and clean intent. The other was a gift poisoned at the source. I moved a week later. The first night, the city hummed outside my windows like a reassurance instead of a threat. I unpacked slowly, choosing where things would live like I was writing a new language. Thomas brought a plant and a terrible pun printed on a card that made me laugh until I had to lean on the counter. We kissed for the first time a few nights after that on a walk along the lake where the air tasted like rain. It wasn't fireworks. It was relief. The mentorship program grew legs. We added a workshop series on real-world briefs, brought in a tax professional to demystify invoices and quarterly payments, because terror of the taxman is universal, and built a small directory of hiring managers who actually followed through. The first time one of our designers emailed to say she'd landed a full-time role, I sat very still and let that victory do what it needed to me. If you've ever taken something that hurt you and turned it into something that helps someone else, you know the alchemy I'm talking about. Midway through this rebuilding, an email from my parents arrived that I stared at for a full minute before opening. Subject line: Honest update. The message was simple and unlike them. We're in therapy twice a week. We've joined a financial accountability group. We've closed all credit cards except one with a hard limit. Here are the automatic payments we've set to meet the restitution schedule. We understand if you don't respond. I didn't, not immediately. I let the data points sit next to the memories and didn't make them reconcile before they were ready. At our next lunch, my mother didn't wear a watch that cost rent. My father asked about my work and listened to the answer. When the check came, he reached for it with hands that didn't shake. These were small things. Small things matter. Natalie and I took a weekend to design the mentorship brand properly, the way we would for a client. We argued about colors and allies and what we would and wouldn't promise. We laughed about how different that conversation would have been a year ago, when it would have been more about winning the argument than the work. Walter stopped by the studio space we'd borrowed for the day, pretended not to hover, then insisted on ordering lunch because artists forget to eat when they think. Jennifer reviewed our operating agreement like a hawk, then slid it back with a rare smile. You two might actually pull this off, she said. Just don't be nice when you should be clear. I printed that and taped it to the wall. Not everything was graceful. There was a blow-up with Thomas the night I flinched at an expensive dinner he insisted on paying for. He thought I didn't want him to take care of me. I thought he was trying to buy his way past my discomfort. We stood on the sidewalk saying the wrong parts out loud until we stopped, took a breath and chose the right parts. I like you, he said, hands out of his pockets like a surrender. I want to celebrate you without making you feel trapped. I like you, I said back, feeling ridiculous and 12 and completely honest, and I don't want to be bought ever again. We split a slice of cake on a bench and called it growth. There were nights the anger came back and burned hot. Not at the money but at the years. At the way 18-year-old me had learned to make smallness look like virtue. At the way 25-year-old me celebrated paying off one loan without knowing the account it could have come from. I let myself feel it without making it a home. That was new. Around month 8, Stanley called with an update that landed like a stone in a pond. We've recovered more than we forecast, he said. Some investments we thought were dead had residual value. After fees and taxes, your liquid position is approximately 1.2 million. I didn't say anything for a long beat because the last time a number changed my life, it was attached to a betrayal. This one felt like a half-healed scar suddenly warming. Walter and I built a plan that wasn't exciting enough for a movie montage. Boring, diversified, automated. He made me write the why of every allocation in plain language and read it back to him. If you can't explain it, he said, you don't own it. Ownership, of money, choices, time, was the spine of everything I was trying to build. And then, right when the story threatened to become only spreadsheets and progress, life reminded me it's still life. A small business publication ran a piece on legacy transitions in family-owned empires and, without naming me, described a granddaughter who refused to let theft define her. The phrasing made me bristle and breathe easier in the same second. I read the article twice, then closed the tab and went for a run I did not want to take, because movement is sometimes the only way to keep from getting stuck in a sentence. On a gray Sunday, I agreed to see my parents' apartment for the first time. It was clean and unremarkable. No marble, no wine fridge humming to itself like a status symbol. My mother had a plant on the windowsill that looked a lot like the one Olivia gave me a lifetime ago. My father offered me tea in a chipped mug. They didn't ask for anything. They showed me their budget binder like it was a fragile animal. They told me about the group they attended at a community center where people talked about money the way other groups talk about drinking. I didn't forgive them in that room. But something in me unclenched. I left with nothing but a promise to see them again next month, and it felt like both not enough and exactly right. Somewhere between month 9 and 10, the mentorship program landed its first grant, small but validating. We built a second cohort and I watched them critique each other's work with generosity and rigor that would have embarrassed some of the agency rooms I'd sat in. Natalie gave a talk about confidence that had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with showing up repeatedly. Jennifer joined a panel on how not to get eaten alive by contracts, and the students took more notes than I'd ever seen. Walter sent pizza and refused to attend because he didn't want to be the weather system in the room. He was learning to. The closer we got to the 1-year mark, the more I thought about endings that aren't endings. About how stories like mine don't have finales so much as chapters that quiet down. I started planning a small dinner at my place for the anniversary. Not a celebration of the explosion but of the rebuild. I made a list. Walter, if he felt up to it. Jennifer, Stanley for 10 minutes even though he hates parties. Natalie with the dessert she pretends she baked. Thomas with whatever wine he thinks pairs with relief. Olivia, of course, because she was there at the beginning, holding a blanket and a truth I couldn't say yet. Before that night, there was one more mediation session. Paperwork to finalize. A last tranche of liquidation to confirm. My parents arrived with their lawyer and something quieter in their faces than I had ever seen. They signed what needed signing without bargaining. When it was done, my mother asked if she could say one thing. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I nodded. "We understand," she said, "that we don't get to ask for your forgiveness. We understand that we might never earn it. We're learning how to be people who don't confuse love with taking." My father didn't add anything. For once, that was right. I walked out into late afternoon sun that made the city look scrubbed. Thomas was across the street with 2 coffees he swore he'd only just bought. I was in the neighborhood, he lied. We walked nowhere in particular and it felt like the point. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down what this year had taught me that had nothing to do with money. That boundaries can be a way to keep love alive instead of a way to shut it down. That asking for help is a skill. That dignity looks like a lot of quiet, unphotogenic decisions. I thought about posting it. I didn't. I wanted to keep it mine a little longer. If you've made it this far with me, if any part of this sounds like a chapter you've survived or are still writing, hit like so I know you're out there, subscribe so you don't miss the ending, and tell me in the comments, as much or as little as you want, what rebuilding has looked like for you. We're almost at the part where the year completes a circle and the future starts to look less like a reaction and more like a plan. On the morning of the dinner, Walter called to say he'd be a few minutes late and to ask if I needed extra chairs. I told him I had enough. He said he'd bring 2 anyway. Jennifer texted a photo of a cake box balanced on a spreadsheet and wrote, "Work? Life balance." Natalie sent a screenshot of the mentorship site with our new cohort featured and 3 words I didn't expect: "Proud of us." I put flowers on the table, the good glasses by the sink, and the recipe for a salad taped to the cabinet because I always forget the order of the dressing. When the knock came, it was earlier than I expected. I wiped my hands and opened the door to find, not my guests, but an envelope on the mat with my name written in my father's careful print. No one in the hall. The elevator doors closing at the end like a period. Inside the envelope, a check smaller than the damage but larger than I believed possible, a copy of their last therapy homework titled, "Amends We Can Sustain," and a short note that said only, "We are learning. Thank you for giving us room to try." I stood there a long time before I folded the paper and put it in a drawer I now reserve for things I don't have to decide about immediately. Then I lit the candles because people I trust were coming to my table, and because this was a night about what we build after the dust settles. Not because the past is resolved, but because the future deserves more than the past got. And that, right there between the knock and the first coat on the back of a chair, is where I'll pause. The next knock was firmer, familiar. Walter, leaning on his cane a little more than he wanted to admit. Jennifer just behind him with a bakery box and a folded spreadsheet poking from her tote like a bookmark. "We're not late," he announced preemptively, glancing at his watch as if daring it to contradict him. "You're exactly on time," I said, taking their coats, guiding them inside, letting the smell of butter and sugar loosen something tight in my chest. Natalie arrived with a laugh that warmed the room faster than my radiator ever could, 2 paper bags stacked in her arms, and a mock confession ready on her lips. "These are store-bought and I will lie if anyone asks." Thomas was last, cheeks pink from the wind, a bottle of red in one hand and a sheepish "Are we okay?" in his eyes that I answered with a nod I felt all the way down. We ate. We passed plates and told the kind of stories that come out only when the room feels safe. None of the heroic summaries we give at work, none of the staged confessions we give online, just small, unglamorous truths that sounded like breathing. I spilled dressing. Walter said the bread was too soft. Jennifer quietly turned the knives to face the same way. Natalie arranged the tulips like a stylist until we teased her into stopping. Thomas refilled glasses and looked at me like he was cataloging the moment on purpose. After the pasta and before dessert, Walter raised his glass and the room, obedient as gravity, stilled. "To truth," he said, not as a flourish this time, but as a sentence that had earned the right to be simple. We echoed him and something tight in my ribs gave way. When the plates were cleared and the tea steamed in our mismatched mugs, Walter leaned back, studied me the way he studies blueprints, and nodded once as if signing off on a final inspection. "You did this," he said. "Not the lawyers. Not the market. Not me." I felt the words land like tools on a workbench. Solid, useful, mine. Later, after coats and hugs and the quiet that follows good noise, Thomas and I washed the last fork as if it were delicate. "Do you feel done?" he asked, which was the wrong question and also the right one. "No," I said. "But I feel steady." He smiled and the steadiness deepened. That night, when the lights were out and the city hummed like a lullaby that knew my name, I dreamed not about ledgers or locks changing, but about doors I could open without bracing first. Morning brought ordinary errands that felt exalted by context. I watered plants. I answered emails. I texted Olivia a photo of the tulips with a caption that said, "Still standing." She replied with a row of hearts and "proud of you," which I saved because sometimes simple sentences hold up entire days. Around noon, Jennifer called with the tone she reserves for the calendar. "Two things," she said. 1. The last tranche from the Florida sale cleared. 2. Your parents' payment posted early. Early. It was such a small word. It felt enormous. I opened the drawer with the envelope and looked at it the way you look at a sleeping animal you're not sure you want to wake. Not yet, I thought. Some decisions improve with patience. I closed the drawer and wrote to Stanley instead. "Please allocate this month's restitution to the scholarship line for the program." He replied with a thumbs-up emoji that somehow didn't cheapen the gravity. Work gathered me into its necessary rhythm. My team was deep in a rollout, the kind of project where dozens of tiny choices add up to a single coherent sentence set in color and shape. I delegated. I corrected kerning. I called a client before they could panic and made calm sound contagious. At lunch, I answered a DM from one of our ments who had just received a second interview. "What should I wear?" they asked. I wrote back, "Confidence you can sit in for an hour. Shoes you can walk a mile in if the elevator breaks. And a question you genuinely want answered." 10 minutes later, a picture arrived of an outfit laid out on a bedspread. "Perfect," I wrote and meant it. In the middle of that ordinary day, my phone lit with a name I still wasn't used to seeing outside of emergency. "Mom." I let it go to voicemail and listened later, sitting on the floor with my back against the counter the way I had sat the night everything cracked open. "No request," her voice said, brave in its plainness. "Just an update. We're on track. We're learning. Thank you." I didn't call back. I sent a text instead. Received. "Thank you for the update. Simple. Enough." Weeks passed in that new shape. Walter took to calling in the evenings to ask mundane questions he pretended were essential. "Do you own a decent flashlight?" he asked one Tuesday. Emergencies don't announce themselves. When I said no, he had one sent over that could land airplanes. "Do you have renter's insurance?" he asked on a Thursday. "Yes," I said, proud and 6 years old in the same breath. He grunted like I'd passed a test we hadn't agreed upon. Jennifer stopped by the mentorship workshop to do a segment called Reading Contracts Without Crying, and the students took notes as if each bullet point was a map out of a forest. Natalie and I argued cheerfully about the brand tone for the program's newsletter. She wanted wit. I wanted warmth. We found a voice that could hold both. Thomas and I learned each other's fault lines and ways around them, how to say, "I'm scared" without sounding like, "I'm leaving," how to celebrate good days without spending money we didn't need to prove we were happy. Midway through that calmer season, the journalist who'd written the vague piece about legacy transitions asked for a follow-up, still promising anonymity. I declined with thanks and didn't feel like I was running away. It felt like choosing the size of the story I wanted to live in. Quick check-in while you're here. If this journey has resonated with you, if you've ever had to rebuild after a truth you didn't ask for, tap like so the story finds the people who need it. Subscribe if you want more of these chapters told with nothing dressed up and nothing held back. And in the comments, share as much as you're comfortable. The one boundary that changed your life. You might hand someone else a flashlight. Spring nudged the city awake. On a morning that smelled like rain, deciding to be generous, Walter announced a walk. 10 blocks, he said. We made it 6 before he sat on a low wall and pretended that had been the plan. Your grandmother hated umbrellas, he offered apropos of nothing, which was exactly how his stories begin. He told me about the year they couldn't afford a vacation and camped in the living room with a fan for wind and a pot of water for lake noises. He told me about my mother at 9, selling lemonade with a ledger she guarded like a crown jewel. She lost that somewhere, he said, not unkind, more like a man noting a misplaced tool he meant to find. We walked the last 4 blocks slowly, and when we reached my building he looked up at it, then at me, and said, "Good bones." It was the highest praise he gives structures, and I wore it all day like armor. Not everything softened. There were nights I sat alone at my table and scratched rage into a notebook I later tore up and threw away. There were mornings I woke sure I could smell the Gold Coast lobby's floral installation, the scent of what should have been, and had to stand at the window breathing city air until the ghost dissipated. There were texts from old acquaintances who had somehow heard a candy-coated version of the story and wanted details. I learned to say, "It's private," and mean it without apology. And then the call I didn't expect. The community center where my parents' accountability group met asked if I would speak at a town hall-style event on financial harm within families. Victims, counselors, people in recovery. "No names necessary," the coordinator said. "No details you don't want. Just, what helped?" I said no on the phone and yes an hour later because the terror in my throat felt suspiciously like the same thing that had once kept me quiet. The room was less formal than I'd feared. Folding chairs, terrible coffee, a whiteboard that had seen better markers. I talked for 12 minutes about budgets and boundaries and how sometimes justice looks like a spreadsheet and sometimes it looks like not attending Thanksgiving. I didn't see my parents in the crowd. I didn't look for them. After, a woman my age with ink on her fingers said, "I thought it was just me," and I realized how many table for two secrets live in houses with perfect lawns. On the way home my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We heard you spoke tonight. Thank you." No signature. I didn't need one. Summer arrived with its loud generosity. The mentorship program secured a city grant, which meant we could pay guest instructors instead of guilting them into volunteering. We added a portfolio review day and had to bring in extra chairs. One of our first cohort landed at a studio I'd wanted to work at since college and sent a photo of her keycard with the caption, "We did it." I forwarded it to Walter, who replied with a period, his version of champagne. Natalie and I argued over the program's second-year goals, which meant somehow we were already imagining a second year. We designed a poster campaign to recruit outside the usual schools, taped them up ourselves on bulletin boards that smelled like gyms and cafeterias, and hope. Thomas and I took a weekend to simply be elsewhere. A town 2 hours away with a used bookstore and a diner that did pancakes like they were auditioning for a role. We didn't talk about money or parents or even work more than once. We read in silence and passed each other lines we liked and pretended that time wasn't a thing with rules. At the end of the second day he asked, without preface, "Do you want this to be long?" I said yes before I remembered to be afraid. One morning in August, Stanley called with a quiet in his voice that I had learned meant the news was decent but fragile. "Final accounting is complete," he said. "Civil obligations are met as agreed. There will be small, scheduled payments ongoing, but the heavy lift is done." Done. The word landed like a book closing and like a door opening and like a breath I hadn't finished since that night under chandeliers. I thanked him, then sat on the floor and let the stillness be loud. That week I opened the drawer and took out the envelope. I called my parents and asked them to meet me at a public garden with an ugly fountain I loved because it tried so hard. They arrived together looking like people who had learned to occupy less space. I handed the envelope back. "This," I said, "goes to a fund in your names administered by the program. It will pay for software and classes for students whose parents can't help yet. Consider it restitution that grows in a direction I can live with." My mother cried in the contained way of someone practicing new skills. My father said, "Thank you," like a man who had practiced too. "This is not forgiveness," I added. "This is architecture. Forgiveness is separate. Still under construction." They nodded. We sat on a bench and talked about the weather like amateurs at peace talks. It was enough. On the 1-year anniversary of the dinner where truth announced itself, I set my table again. Same plates, same candles, same too soft bread Walter would complain about. Olivia came early and lined up spoons like a general. Jennifer arrived on time to the second, put her phone face down and declared it a historic event. Stanley stopped by for 15 minutes and left with a napkin-wrapped cookie he swore wasn't for him. Natalie brought a tart and the kind of story that makes everyone lean forward. Walter lifted his glass and gave the same toast, but this time I heard the comma after it. "To truth and to what we build after." We ate. We laughed. We did not pretend the year had been anything other than what it was. After everyone left, the apartment felt full rather than empty, as if the air itself had agreed to be a better tenant. I carried the last plate to the sink and, for once, did not think about what might have been. I thought about exactly what was. The next morning I filmed this, the story you've been listening to, told not to make anyone into a hero or a villain, but to map a path through a kind of wreckage that too many of us walk through alone. If you've made it here with me, through shock and paperwork, through anger and therapy, through dinner tables that held and dinner tables that didn't, thank you. If any part of this felt like your reflection, even blurred, I hope you know you're not strange or weak for still loving people who hurt you, for setting boundaries that make you feel mean, for needing more time than a movie montage allows. Before we close, I'm going to ask you for 3 things, the same 3 I would have asked myself a year ago if I'd known how. First, tap like if you want more stories told in this plain voice without the glamour that makes pain look prettier than it is. It helps this find the people sitting at their own kitchen tables with their own envelopes. Second, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The practical pieces, the interviews with counselors and planners who helped me turn chaos into structure, the updates from our ments who are already making the industry better. Third, in the comments if you can share 1 sentence about a boundary you built or a truth that saved you. Keep names out if you need to. Keep it to 6 words if that's all you can manage. I promise I'll read them, and I promise someone else will need yours. Here is how my year ends, which is to say how the next one begins. I woke early on a day that looked like a clean page, walked to the lake and watched the water practice being endless. I called my parents and told them I'd see them for coffee next month, same place, same hour, and that we would keep doing the work of being related without making it the work of erasing what happened. I called Walter and told him I'd bought a decent flashlight. He grunted his approval and told me to store water. I sent Jennifer the final drafts for the workshop series and she sent back 3 comments that made the whole thing smarter. I kissed Thomas on a street corner and didn't worry about who saw, because for once I wasn't carrying an explanation heavier than the moment. Then I came home, opened my laptop and moved the restitution line into a new column labeled Legacy Projects, because I wanted a word that meant both memory and momentum. The betrayal will always be a chapter in this story, one I will not edit out because it taught me the difference between wealth and safety, between family and trust. But it is not the title. The title is what comes after. The dinners that make room for truth, the work that pays clean, the rooms where young designers learn to name their worth, the ordinary mornings where I water plants and answer emails and notice that my life fits me. To truth. To boundaries that hold. To lights kept charged and doors that open because we chose the hinges. And to you, on the other side of this screen, choosing your next sentence.